Okay, previously I'd been embedding these, at least that was my intent, to embed these in the PowerPoint, but I don't think it's going to work as well. This is a pretty long one. I don't think it's a pretty hard one, but I'm gonna just alt-tab back and forth between the lecture then and the assignment. So when we look at homework 3, and this is deriving obviously from lecture 2.2, here's what I'm going to need you and your fellow teammates to fill out. Part 1, what is the official term for each of the 4 below? So I'm just making sure that you can go from the add, bad, shorty descriptions I use, subtract, good, to the official terms. So when you turn this template in, you're going to turn it in with those official terms, if you will, please. Okay? So just use the template, and right where it says equal, then fill in the blank. Right? It'd be that simple. Okay? And then I want you to provide, we better just make this a little smaller, right, a little smaller. Then part 2, I want you to provide your own example of the 4 below for a B-mod program, addressing an earlier adjustment challenge. For example, I want to reduce procrastination on writing papers. Then what's an example of a positive punishment for failing to reduce procrastination? Positive punishment. What is that? Positive is add, punishment is bad, so I got to add bad if I procrastinate. So I'm going to commit, right? So what would be a positive punishment to manipulate one's tendency to procrastinate? What would be a negative punishment? What would be a positive reinforcement? What would be a negative reinforcement? So we got to lay that out. What are my consequences that I'm going to provide for myself when I succeed in my goal or when I fall short of my goal? So spell that out. Choose the example you wish. It's something you guys can agree upon as team members and work through that. Help each other on this. So provide your own example of a written plan. And now we take those elements, we've taken the problem, we've taken the elements, and we're going to provide an example of a written plan. For example, quitting smoking, right? I smoke 20 cigarettes a day. That's a problem. I used to smoke. I haven't smoked for like 10 years now, but I used to smoke about a pack and a half a day. That'd be 30 cigarettes a day, right? So let's say I smoke 20 cigarettes a day. That is a problem, clearly identified. I want to become smoke-free. That's the adjustment challenge. Notice how these are clearly stated. There's no doubting where I am and where I want to go. I weigh 213 pounds. I want to weigh 175 pounds, right? Spell it out, whatever the issue is. Right? So what am I going to do? Every day this week, and this is where the incrementing comes in. That'll be on the next slide when we return to the PowerPoint. Every day this week, I will smoke 19 cigarettes or less. So I go from 20 the previous week, and now I commit to 19 a day. Right? My reward will be blank for accomplishing this, and this will be at the end of the completed week, all 7 days at 19 cigarettes, right? And I spell out what my reward will be. And it can be adding something good, right? Or it can be removing something bad. Either functions as a reward. Spell out also and commit to yourself that my punishment will be blank if I fall short of this goal. Next week, 18 cigarettes a day. The idea is incrementing behaviors makes it far less noticeable and far less impactful a behavioral change. Okay. And then, let's continue on with the assignment here. Here you go. Part 3, classical conditioning components are blank and blank. So what are the 2 elements to classical conditioning? Right? And that was on the chart there. So, classical conditioning defined. Give me a definition of classical conditioning. Identify at least 2 stimulus response relationships for the above. Now, I imagine most of you don't smoke, have never smoked, and never will smoke, and good on you for that, right? What I learned as a smoker, though, is if the phone rang, before I could actually answer the phone, I would have to pick up cigarettes, light one to talk on the phone. Notice how the stimulus, the phone, is causing the behavior, right? So, like it's part of a ritual. The stimulus is the trigger, the phone ringing, the response is a triggered behavior. Here's where we then investigate the idea of response substitution. Give an example of one potential response substitution, right? The stimulus remains the same, so now I hear a phone ring, but instead of grabbing my cigarettes, right, I'm going to substitute a response. Let's say I grab some kind of flexible toy, something that I can fiddle with in my hands, right? Or I pop in a breath mint, right, to take care of the oral. So I somehow substitute a response, right? So the stimulus remains the same, but we consciously, mindfully substitute a more desirable response, like the breath mint or some kind of fidget toy, or maybe one of those spinner toys, right? So for example, if I'm trying to become less argumentative, a stimulus may be a point at which I disagree, triggers a response to argue. I might then substitute the response of asking a question. So it's like, oh my God, I can't believe they said that. Oh my God, my natural response to that stimulus is to argue, but what I'm going to do instead of argue is I'm going to consciously substitute the response of saying, oh, that's an interesting viewpoint. Can you tell me more why you feel that way, right? So I substitute a question. That is, we have a tremendous amount of control over ourselves, but it's important for us to learn the mechanisms and how they operate so that we can begin to exercise increased control. Now, stimulus avoidance is another way to give an example of one potential way to avoid stimulus that causes the unwanted response. Right? If I tend to argue when I'm on an online discussion forum, then I might avoid discussion forums to diminish the argumentative responding. Or if I tend to smoke when drinking, which a lot of people do, right? Then maybe while I'm trying to quit, I need to avoid drinking or establish where drinking and smoking go together, right? So that would be stimulus avoidance. And I want an example of that. So respond to each one of these points, right? And that's it. So if you have any questions, what are you going to do? You're going to ask them in our meeting, or you're going to come to office hours and ask there. Okay. So then let's continue off where we left off. We've explored homework 3. Any questions? You're going to shoot them on up to me. Boom, here we go. I didn't promise you smooth necessarily, did I? And I guess I'm living up to that. So we discussed the idea of incrementing, right? And the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Lao Tzu would say that. One of my favorite examples of incrementing is the famous Stanley Milgram experiment. And how did this work? Well, the teacher was to shock the learner every time the learner was wrong, and the learner was going to be wrong a lot because that's the way the experiment was set up. But notice the shock generator. The first shock is 15 volts, and no one really objected to giving the learner a 15-volt shock. No big deal. And when we say, okay, so they were wrong again, now you have to increment the shock one switch upwards, so now you're going to give them a shock of 30 volts, right? And everyone's like, okay, well, it's only 30 volts, right? And then the next time they're wrong, well, you got to go up another 15 volts, that's 45 volts, well, it's only 45 volts, or the comparative logic is it's only 15 more volts than they withstood last time, and 15 volts is nothing. Well, before you know it, you got 2/3 of the participants that flipped that last switch on the learner, and that's like 450 volts, labeled danger, extreme, shock, quite likely deadly. But how do you move people in the direction, or how do you move yourself in the direction you want? Well, either Lao Tzu or Stanley Milgram would say we do it incrementally. And I think it's one of the most powerful approaches to changing behavior. Now, flooding, I don't think we use too much anymore. It's also known as implosion therapy, and it's probably a good idea. Significant exposure to stimulus in a safe and controlled environment, right? And examples. Well, let's suppose someone's afraid of flying. What do? You toss them on a plane, lock the door, and hope for the best, right? Or let's suppose you're afraid of snakes. This is a horrible example, but you're afraid of snakes, so what do? I throw you in a pit full of snakes. And guess what? You survive. And then the idea is, having survived, then you realize that the fear was irrational, you can get past it, and you're good to go. Not a commonly used technique, and you can see why. Who knows how many heart attacks were induced through flooding. So, now aversion therapy is pairing a negative stimulus consequence with a behavior. So a buddy of mine, when I was growing up, he was several years older than I, he got this job working at this place. It was 1970s. This is so 70s. He got this job working for the Schick Center for the Control of Smoking. And it was a place you went, right, and you paid money, and they would help you quit smoking. And they relied pretty much on aversion therapy. And I went over there one time with Daniel, and he says, come check this out, right? And I was a smoker at the time. And so in one spot, honest to God, you sit down at this table in this little cubicle, right? And you're asked to go through your smoking ritual, but he's got you hooked up to an electrical shock apparatus. This is not a major shock, but it's certainly an annoying shock. And so as you reach for the pack of cigarettes, it gives you the shock, right? Because he's sitting behind you, can't see what he's doing. And then if you take the cellophane, right, to open it, and you take grab your letter, and the idea is that these noxious stimuli, these aversive stimuli, become associated with every aspect of the smoking behavior, causing that behavior to become less and less desirable. What do you think? And they also did a thing where you had to chain smoke in this little cubicle, right? And I swear to God, it was nasty. There was like this turkey platter that was an ashtray, and I mean, it's just got cigarettes like this, right? And you have to go smoke 5 or 6 cigarettes, and you light them right off the other, and oh my God, the smoke in there and the smell is enough to make anyone sick. These are largely ineffective. Why do you think that is? Well, note, if I go out into the parking lot now, and I'm not hooked up to the shock apparatus, I'm out in the fresh air and I smoke, the smoke is rewarding once again. So these aversion therapy processes are easily undone. Now, systematic desensitization, this is a more appropriate method. So imagine you have a fear of flying. What it does then is move you a step at a time, so it is using incrementing towards the desired behavior. And I saw this interesting documentary on fear of flying, and what they did is people then registered for the course to overcome their fear in flying, and what they did is they met at a restaurant that was next door to an airport for their first meeting, right? And then the next meeting they meet in the terminal at the airport in a restaurant, but don't go anywhere near the gates, right? And then they go to the gate. And then the next meeting, they actually are told, you're going to go on a plane, but the plane's never going to go anywhere. We're just going to go sit in the plane and have our meeting, right? And it's going to remain hooked up. The door's going to be open. And most people say, oh, I can do that, right? And we move a step at a time. Next time we close the door, we start the engines, but we promise we're not going to fly anywhere. And eventually, boom, we take a short flight and you're good to go. So the source of the fear is identified, and we increment people past that fear, right? So exposures incrementally increased while practicing relaxation technique is a nice component. So we've also told people how to control their anxiety, how to breathe, and the pace is typically a function of client success. So we monitor the client's success at each step and don't push them beyond what they can handle. One that's overlooked, but more difficult maybe to use, is a stimulus-response combination can deteriorate over time by the basis of extinction. And this is often useful when we're raising children. You know, often we're told we have to pick and choose our battles, and such is true with raising children. There are some things that are super important that can't be tolerated. Children can't run out into the street without looking, right? Because they might die as a result of this. But if a child fails to take out the trash, right, or demonstrates some other kind of non-dangerous behavior, sometimes if we just don't play rewards and we don't play punishment, then the child doesn't really get anything out of it. If a child throws a tantrum in a store when they don't get something, rather than spank the child or leave the store or cave in and give them something, why not just walk away and say, hey, when you're done with your tantrum, catch up with me. I got shopping to do. And what happens is you've robbed any kind of consequence at all for their behavior. It doesn't generate a positive outcome. It doesn't generate a negative outcome. And under such conditions, often then the behavior just goes extinct. It just extinguishes itself of its own. But you have to pick and choose, and it's not maybe the most successful technique. Anyway, a little choppy in the interim between part 1 and part 2 there. I apologize for that, but This is homework 3, and I think the behaviorists have got a lot of good ideas that can help us face our adjustment challenges. So as Frack said hello to us in the beginning, Frack is going to say goodbye, adios, and best of luck on your adjustment challenges. See you guys later.